Did you know that modern psychoanalysis was born during the First World War? Wars and belligerence have always served as an engine for pushing human inventions and technologies to the limit, and it is during the First World War that PTSD, or shell shock as it was called at the time, was discovered. In this episode of History Pills, we will shortly glance through history to understand how shell shock was discovered, perceived, and treated during the last 100 years. Let's go with the intro. In this picture, we can see a field hospital with many wounded soldiers during the First World War. It is estimated that during the war, more than 21 million deaths occurred, as well as about 23 million wounded. Medicine and science played a major role in saving lives. It is, however, mostly unknown how mental disorders highly impacted the war and the life of thousands of men for the next decades. Today, we are all probably aware that being exposed to sudden fears or dangers may impact the psyche of a human being. Prior to the Great War, however, this was mostly unknown. For the first time in history, millions of men were sent into trenches. Men that would spend days or months under constant bomb shelling, with their life being constantly under threat. And it is in this scenario that military high commands begin observing thousands of men that were apparently fine and healthy, suffering from panic attacks, inability to reason or to sleep, walk, or even talk. At first, these cases were branded as a lack of moral fibre or as internal lesions to the brain due to the explosions. A new term was indeed coined: shell shock. Quite weirdly, however, no internal damages were found by doctors. Moreover, officers suffered these problems in much higher rates than common enlisted men, with many officers not even being exposed to artillery fire. An emotional injury explanation began to be studied by many psychoanalysts. Later on, Sándor Ferenczi, a Hungarian psychoanalyst, pioneer of the psychoanalytic school and a close associate of Sigmund Freud, will say that it is thanks to war that modern psychoanalysis was born. Meanwhile, on the front line, with the months going on, the situation became unsustainable. By December 1913, just 6 months after the beginning of the war, as many as 10% of British officers and 4% of enlisted men were experiencing nervous and mental shock. A few years later, at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, as many as 40% of casualties were shell-shocked, resulting in concern about an epidemic of psychiatric casualties which could not be afforded in either military or financial terms. The way soldiers were treated vastly varied based on the commander and the country. The British Army in France, for example, was instructed that shell shock and shell concussion cases should have the letter W prefixed to the report of the casualty, if it was due to the enemy. In that case, the patient will be entitled to rank as wounded and to wear on his arm a 1 stripe. If, however, the man's breakdown did not follow a shell explosion, it was not thought to be due to the enemy, and he was to be labeled shell shock, or S for sickness, and was not entitled to a wound, stripe, or a pension. Nonetheless, some men suffering shell shock were put on trial, and even executed for military crimes, including desertion and cowardice. More than 3,000 British shell shock cases were sentenced to death for cowardice, of which more than 300 were executed. In France, 2,000 men were similarly sentenced, with 700 actually shot. In Italy, in some dramatic occurrences, like at the time of the Caporetto defeat, a substantial number of soldiers were dealt rough justice in front of firing squads under the suspicion of desertion. On the other side of the front line, in Germany, more than 100,000 men went through field hospitals in the first year of the war, suffering from symptoms of hysteria or the more genteel neurasthenia. These men were considered coward and unworthy. However, contrary to the British and the French, only 150 men were condemned and 48 executed. With the end of the war, these disorders kept persisting with no cure being found. In the United Kingdom alone, 10 years after the end of the war, 60,000 men were yet in hospital undergoing treatment for shell shock. This disorder, known today as post-traumatic stress disorder, will be discovered again by the American Army during the Vietnam War. Since then, medicine has continued studying this disorder. In reality, however, still today, more than 100 years later, we don't have a cure for it. Do you know any other piece of hidden history? Share it in the comments. Thanks for watching. Bye!